Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Seed Speaks. This is a video series brought to you by Seed World Group. My name is Rebecca Carmelli Peslak, and I am the digital media producer for Seed World Group. Today, we are talking about trade policies and trade wars. Trade policies are constantly evolving and, in some cases, being challenged through trade wars worldwide. How does trade impact the seed and agricultural sectors? As we dive into policies and trade wars, we'll learn about the impact free trade has on agriculture. We'll also learn about current trade conflicts worldwide. Today, I am joined by two experts to discuss trade policies and trade wars. Michelle Kleiger, President of Stratagerm Consulting, and Neil Townsend, Chief Marketing Analyst at FarmLink. Michelle, Neil, thank you both so much for joining me today and bringing your expertise to Seed Speaks. Michelle, could you briefly introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Rebecca, so much for having me. I enjoy being part of this discussion a lot. I have a strong background, a big background in trade, and especially in agriculture trade and seed trade. So my first job was a agricultural consultant in DC, where I evaluated a lot of international trade programs as well as kept track of food production globally for different governments. So just understanding that first level of how much understanding where food is coming from and how much it produced is so important to countries as they consider how to keep their populations fed. And then after that, working for the American Seed Trade Association for 5 years as the director of international trade and helping seed companies move seed and germplasm and so forth around the world. So since then, I am an agricultural economist. I have my own business, Stratagerm Consulting, and I wrote a book called The Demise of Free Trade when the US and China were in the height of their trade war in 2018. So I'm excited to talk more about this today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle. Neil, could you also introduce yourself, please?
Yes, my name's Neil Townsend. I come from Winnipeg, Canada, and I've worked for about 25 years in the agricultural sector. I worked with the Canadian Wheat Board, and market access and trade have always been very important. Today, I work with farmers across Western Canada, giving them advice. And from a Canadian point of view, access to markets is incredibly critical. We produce way more grain than we need, and oil seeds and pulses. So, we're subject to a lot of the rules and regulations, or just, de facto trade, hard to get into markets, those kinds of things. So we're very interested in this. And of course, seeds are not maybe my particular area. I deal with usually the commodity level, but the seeds have been increasingly important for us in Western Canada because of global climate change and changing weather patterns, and just the seed technology has been instrumental in sort of maintaining competitive yields.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Neil. And I will start the first question with you. How does trade and the ag and seed sectors overlap?
Well, as I mentioned in my introduction, I think one thing that's been instrumental for Western Canada is the development of seeds that, have adapted to sort of, different weather patterns. I mean, we've had, more heat, lack of rain, those kinds of things. And in this year in particular, in 2023, we've had a lot of challenges. And yet some of the seeds and the new technologies in those seeds have performed very good and maintained a yield that wouldn't have been really possible many, many years ago. Of course, Canada is a trading nation, so we trade the surplus that we produce, and in many cases, the surplus that we produce is critical to the world's food supply. And there's a market for it. So if we were to kind of fall short of developing the new seeds that can withstand what's presented to increase yield, to manage the land better, all of those kinds of things, like we'd potentially, fall back and not have the surplus that, we have been exporting over the last, 50 years to the rest of the world.
Awesome. Michelle, did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I'll add a few things on the seed specific side of the conversation. And so, for the seed industry, trade is really important and provides some real benefits in that you get more breeding cycles in. So, with northern and southern hemispheres, you're able to have extra breeding cycles, which speeds up that time to market for commodities. I mean, for seeds that will eventually be turned into commodities. It also allows us to try different climates. And so you're actually testing varieties where they're going to be planted instead of just in research labs. And I would also say that there are different regions that we produce seed in. So just like there are grain or vegetable or flower producing regions, there are specific places around the world where seed companies are producing and multiplying those seeds. And so there are competitive advantages in those places. It might be mechanical harvesting maybe in the US, or it might be availability of labor and hand pollination and so forth in other countries. So the seed industry, by being so global, has taken advantage not only of expertise around the world and breeding programs around the world, but those competitive advantages of growing and multiplying seed where it makes sense to, testing it in different places, bagging, tagging, cleaning, all of that. The seeds move a lot of places before they're planted by a farmer. And all of that, I think, adds to adding more quality and more stability and potentially lowering prices.
Awesome. You started to get into this a little bit with your answer. So maybe we could take a deeper dive with you first, Michelle. Why is trade important to agriculture? And then the reverse, why is agriculture important to trade?
Well, I'll build actually on what Neil was saying when why trade is important to agriculture. So when you get to the commodities, right, by having global trade, you're not just selling to your one country, you're not selling just to the local economy, but you're able to get those larger economies of scale by selling all over the world. And so we have seen in the United States and Canada where you have larger farms that are able to invest in mechanization and special equipment, and they're able to process a lot, and they have the infrastructure to export. And so all of those efficiencies drive down the price and increase the availability of food, feed, fiber, energy stocks. And so I think from the why trade is important to agriculture, it opens new markets, it gives us new customers, and all of that is nice when you're a business selling something. Reversing the question, why is agriculture important to trade? I would go back to some of the first trade we talk about would be, the spice route or the silk route. Like, our trade has always revolved around moving food products and feeding people. And that is still true today. We have places that are very efficient at growing. They grow more than they necessarily need, and they export it to the rest of the world. And so, for global food security, that trade is a huge factor. And as we have more, whether it's political uncertainty or unrest or climate change or disasters, like all of those create acute food insecurity in one place. And a lot of that can be solved by moving food around.
Great. And Neil, do you want to add to that why trade is important to agriculture and vice versa?
Yeah, I think, comparative advantage with a world that's nearing 9 billion people. If everybody tried to grow their own food supply, it's just going to be very, very difficult to do, or people will eat a much more limited diet than they currently eat. And that's the one thing, as the world sort of, incomes increase, the diet tends to more meat, more processed food, more things like that. And trade is essential to make those, regardless of what you believe about meat or processed food. Like, people need convenience. They're traveling, they're commuting to work, not just in Canada or the United States, but in Bangladesh and Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, wherever it is, they're moving to go to work, and they need convenience and food. And again, if we produce more, we need a market for it. Otherwise, our surplus, people will stop growing. And then when there's, weather or crop failures in other countries and we don't have a surplus, I mean, that will be the problem. The second thing I'd say is, I think that one thing trade can do is it can bring peace and stability to the world. So if we trade in a good and proper fashion, more unfettered, more free trade, that means that countries are linked together, and it's more difficult to have big disputes and arguments. And I think, trade of agricultural goods at the most basic, just feeding people is something that could be a peaceful approach to kind of global, international relations.
Awesome. So building off of that, Neil, I'll start this question with you. How does agriculture build strong economies through trade, and who benefits from agricultural trade?
Well, I mean, I think that, as Michelle mentioned, the farmer profile sort of in North America is a very sophisticated, large-scale farmer. Those farmers have deep investment. They produce a surplus well beyond just their local community that needs to be exported. So they benefit. Like, to farm on that scale and scope, regardless of the product, you need to have markets. Vice versa, there's a lot of small scale farmers around the world. And, this might sound heartless, but I think it's actually heartfelt. They're very small and income is very insecure. A lot of farmers in those areas even have food problems, food scarcity, despite being a primary producer. And, we can sort of free them from that labor. Like, if those farms get bigger and they can find a better source of income, because their food needs of the country or the region are met from imports. I mean, there's other economies of scale and other, practices that they can maybe do. And again, it's going to be a very uncomfortable situation with a lot of problems potential. But, the bottom line is that you want to push people up the income scale. And unfortunately, a lot of small farms in, the developing world are not farms that produce enough income for the family as it is anyways.
Definitely. Michelle, do you want to add on to that?
Sure. I'll take a more macro picture and just add that if we are seeing an increase in food security, and I think at its lowest point right before the pandemic, that number of people living under $2 a day had fallen to only 800 million, which is a very big number. And I'm not trying to take away from that. But, as more people are fed, as more people are nourished, right, it allows them to do more too. So it increases, the brain power of a country. It takes that fear and worry and spending all of your energy trying to find food for yourself, for your family, and moves that into the next level. So I just think that for society as a whole, when we're dealing with less food insecurity, when we are developing these industries, it frees people up to do other tasks and build their countries.
Awesome. Michelle, this question, I'll kick it off with you. How does free trade impact agriculture?
So I don't know that I'm going to necessarily answer the question you want. I would say that when we look at free trade agreements, getting agriculture in them is important. It is also extremely difficult. Agriculture is a very sensitive topic for the reasons that we have discussed so far, right? Like, the quickest way to lose power is to not be able to feed your citizens, or your community. And so food security is hugely important. They're also very old industries and often have a lot of political power. So it's very easy to argue for, or commonly, occurs that we argue for protectionist measures that include trade, that reduces free trade. So I would say that is definitely a challenge. And the broader the agreements are, the more likely agriculture is to be included in them. But it's definitely a challenge to keep agriculture in those agreements, because food and food security are so important culturally that keeping some of that knowledge and those industries alive is common. I would also say that with the evolution of free trade, there are new ways around it. And so we have a lot more non-tariff trade barriers. So whether it's those phytosanitary and other testing requirements, and agriculture faces a lot of those every day. So I would say that, free trade is important. It's important for agriculture, but it is a constant uphill battle.
Totally. Neil, did you want to add to that?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I think, the terms free trade and agriculture are exclusive. They don't really exist. And often when countries have disputes over whatever it is, I mean, feelings are hurt or whatever, it's often turned on agriculture. And there's a lot of buzzwords and paranoia and propaganda about, what farmers are producing. And it can be about a chemical residue, or it could be about like GMO seeds or all sorts of things. So it's, and most countries are urbanized, and the urban populations don't really understand all of the aspects that go into agriculture and how farmers practice, and why they're trying to produce the best, cleanest possible, source of food or feed for animals. So yeah, and I think like my entire career, I started at the government of Canada, and we were lobbying for free trade with the European Union, or freer trade, I guess I would say. And when I was a younger man, I would have thought, oh man, it's so clearly beneficial to everybody involved to free up trade. I bet in 25 years, the world will be much freer and trade will be much freer. And the exact opposite has happened. I would say that there's less market access today than there was 25 years ago.
Interesting. Is there any new legislation that's going to impact trade? Either of you can take this one first.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a constant iteration of legislations, and a lot of them, as Michelle mentioned, are just really non-tariff trade barriers. So they're either protecting an internal, organization, like, there might be a group of growers who have some influence and want something to do that. So there's really like just so many that you can think of that it's hard to pinpoint one. And then the other aspect I just think is like these things are like, to negotiate market access is ridiculously slow, even when the country that wants something, or has a need for something, wants it, but they still make you dot every I, cross every T twice or three times just to make sure it goes like that. So, we've seen it in Canada, and the US faces it, the European Union, all sorts of countries face this thing.
Definitely. Michelle, did you want to add anything onto that?
Sure. I will add that, it's easy to look at trade and say, like, we're agriculture, we only care what's happening in agriculture trade or agreements that are tied directly to agriculture. But I think taking that broader step back, we see a lot of places that trade is going to continue to indirectly influence our industry. And so as we see more environmental regulations showing up in trade, requirements showing up in trade, reporting, all of that is going to have a big impact on agriculture. There's a lot of discussion about digital currency, and moving across is a really popular topic in all trade circles. Currency continues to be a discussion. And then for the seed industry in particular, you face regulation or discussions or agreements that are going to include more discussion on intellectual property, on phytosanitary, and on breeding and what techniques are allowed. So all of those might not directly impact agriculture, but indirectly how we move and think about our economies will trickle down to us for sure.
Totally. Recently, have we seen any conflict with trade, and is it being resolved? Is it able to be resolved? Are we working towards any potential resolutions?
Yeah, there's definitely several. Like the one I will point out first and foremost, which isn't really resolved, is the situation in the Black Sea, where Russia is sort of controlling the export of Ukrainian goods via sea. So that's a big one. But there's a couple other ones that have been recently done, and I think Michelle was alluding to something where, sometimes agriculture can be caught in the crossfire or be collateral damage. Like there's nothing in particular about that thing that's sort of, you give them enough rope that there is sort of something wrong, but then they take that rope and go to a non-logical end. And that's like, so barley with China didn't have market access, and they negotiated, for a long time to renew that market access. And then, just recently, China has approved once again Australian barley, and that has a ripple impact on farmers in Canada because, we'd had market access. Now we have more competition there. And the second one goes back a few years, is just with canola in Canada. And again, something was done regarding China, where offense had been taken. Now, the industry in Canada had given them enough sort of runway to run with it because we kind of put maybe a little higher dockage than we should have into the grain. That means, like instead of sending them 100% canola, you send them 98% canola, and the other 2% is something else, which again, you wouldn't like, but it's not a huge issue. That's more of, usually that can be solved just by monetarily, a negotiation, like, oh, you're not giving us all the canola we want. But that ended up being like a ban for, several years. And there was a lot of politics going around, above and beyond agriculture, which again, from a company standpoint or a farmer standpoint, it's difficult to resolve those issues. And this is just a constant kind of steady stream of these sort of issues where, something unrelated can lead to a loss of a market access or, a prevention of, unfettered, freer trade.
Totally. Michelle, did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I would add sort of to a comment Neil made earlier where he pointed out that he expected trade to keep moving forward. I mean, in this post-World War II, economies are going to be linked. We're going to trade. We're going to, improve everybody along the way. And then saying that, that's where he was and in his career. And now looking forward, like that seems unlikely. And I would say that, between trade wars, the US-China trade war a few years ago, and then the pandemic, we saw a huge reversal, a lot more tariff barriers, a lot more quotas, a lot more export and import restrictions. And while I would say that they don't make the news quite as much right now, I don't feel like most of those have been reversed. And so we have this new normal where there is less free trade. And I think there's sort of this resignation that it is not going to become freer trade in the near future. And there's, the WTO spends a lot of time talking about how we need it and the benefits of trade. So I don't think that, there's not a lot of free trade being resolved. So the challenges we've had recently aren't resolved. There are still a lot of, concerns with India being a huge producer of rice and putting huge export bans on recently. Like, these are all things that we are continuing to live with, and it is the new normal. And I don't know that we're going to have the huge the proliferation of multilateral and bilateral trade agreements that we had for the last couple decades.
That was really interesting. We do have one audience question that I want to quickly address if we can. What role does science play in agricultural trade? And how do we make sure every country is being fair and using actual science when making their trade policies?
So science does play a role in agricultural trade, right? Each country has the ability to set its own policies and regulations and determine what is allowed in and out. I think that there's a lot that is done by industry and, universities and other organizations trying to promote the benefits of agricultural science and technology. That is a conversation that is going on. It is also a sticking point, right? If a country is not adopting the technology, it creates a barrier to trade. If the country just doesn't have the resources to administer the testing required, or to put its own policies in, or to approve new technologies, like that all slows down trade. I will say that there are international bodies that are in place to discuss these things and settle trade disputes, but that does require being on good terms. So it is a challenge, and it is a point that can be a sticking point for trade.
Yeah, like certainly the world doesn't get to 9 billion people or the present population without science and agriculture and trade, because, the Rockefeller Institutes like the International Rice Research Institute and, the various ones around the world, the Green Revolution, all of these things have happened. In the current context, I kind of agree with Michelle. Like there's, the science is incredibly important right now to develop seeds that are resistant to lack of water or higher temperatures, et cetera, to maintain yield growth in a, very uncertain world in terms of, what the weather patterns are going to be going forward, right? And then the final thing I'd say is that, countries do have different standards. So, we label something a GMO here, and the same thing that could be produced as seeds in other countries. I won't name them, but they'll say like, oh, it's obviously like a genetically modified organism, but they don't want to call it that because they still want to have the ability to prohibit at a time of their convenience or when they want to prohibit the entry of a product that's labeled GMO into their markets. That's just an example, and there's other things that are going on, very quickly with seed technology that's advancing very fast. And again, I don't think there's one standard level playing field when it comes to the trade aspect of the science applied to seed technology.
Awesome. Well, that is a wrap on our questions for today. I want to thank both of you, Michelle and Neil, for chatting with me today on Seed Speaks. I really enjoyed learning from both of you and being able to share this information and your expertise with our audience. Next week, tune in as Mark continues our season in politics. Thank you again to everyone for joining us and have a great week.